The snow fell in thick curtains across the Belgian forest that December morning in 1944. Through the white veil, something darker emerged: 8 Tiger tanks, their engines growling like distant thunder. Inside a hastily dug position, an American gun crew watched their approach with the peculiar clarity that comes when you know you're looking at your own death. Their M115 Howitzer was designed to lob shells over hills at targets miles away. It was not designed to face the most feared tank in the world at point-blank range. But their gun commander had a theory. A ridiculous theory. One he'd been ridiculed for suggesting during training stateside. Now, with German armor bearing down on their position and no time to displace, that theory was about to receive the only test that mattered, the kind where you don't get a second chance. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted just days earlier, catching Allied forces in a desperate scramble. The German offensive punched through American lines with a ferocity that seemed to belong to an earlier, more dangerous phase of the war. Intelligence had assured commanders that Germany was finished, incapable of major operations. The men freezing and hastily dug positions across the Ardennes knew different now. The evidence was rolling toward them on steel treads, and it was very much alive. Artillery doctrine was clear and had been since the Howitzer's invention. These weapons fired indirectly, lobbing projectiles in high arcs toward distant targets calculated by forward observers and fire direction centers. The math was complex, the choreography elaborate. Gunners rarely saw what they hit, and they certainly never expected to see what might hit them. That was someone else's job. The direct fire role belonged to tank destroyers, anti-tank guns, and sometimes desperate infantrymen with weapons that seemed laughably inadequate against German armor. The M115 8-inch Howitzer represented American industrial might reduced to its essence. Weighing over 15 tons in firing position, it could throw a 200-pound shell more than 10 miles. Its blast could collapse bunkers, crater roads, and turn concentrations of troops into casualty statistics. What it could not do, according to every manual and every instructor, was fight tanks. The weapon simply wasn't designed for it. Its traverse was limited. Its rate of fire, glacial, compared to dedicated anti-tank weapons. And its sighting systems were built for indirect fire calculations, not tracking moving armor. But there was something else. Something the manuals didn't account for, because it seemed too obvious to mention. That 200-pound shell, when it arrived at its target, arrived with enough energy to crack open anything it touched. The question nobody had seriously asked was simple and terrible. What happened if you removed the arc and fired it straight? The gun commander had asked that question during training in Louisiana. His instructors had looked at him like he'd suggested using the howitzer as a battering ram. The weapon's breech mechanism wasn't designed for flat trajectory fire, they explained. The recoil system would be stressed in ways the engineers never intended. The optics were wrong. The traverse was inadequate. Besides, if you were close enough to direct fire a heavy howitzer at enemy armor, you'd already lost the battle. You displaced, called for support, and let the proper weapons do their job. Except here in the frozen Belgian forest, there was nowhere to displace to. The Tigers had appeared too quickly, their advance covered by the terrain and the weather that grounded air support and limited visibility. The gun crew could abandon their position and retreat through the snow, but that meant losing the howitzer. And more importantly, it meant the German armor would continue through to shred the infantry positions behind them. Men were dug in back their men with rifles and machine guns that would do exactly nothing against Tiger armor. So the gun commander made his decision. They would stay. They would fight, and they would do it wrong, according to every doctrine and every training manual, because wrong was the only option that offered even a theoretical chance of survival. If you have your own story about artillery crews facing impossible odds, or if your family has connections to the Battle of the Bulge, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The crew worked with the efficiency of men who'd trained together until the choreography became instinct. The howitzer's trail spades were already dug in from earlier fire missions. Now they traversed the massive tube as far left as the carriage would allow, watching the Tigers approach through the forest. The lead tank was perhaps 800 yards out, close enough to see the commander in his cupola, scanning the tree line for threats he expected. What he didn't expect was a heavy howitzer aimed horizontally at his bow armor. Loading an 8-inch shell under normal conditions required careful coordination. Loading one when your hands were numb with cold and fear was an exercise in controlled panic. The projectile alone weighed as much as a full-grown man. The powder charge came separately, measured and bagged. The propellant that would transform potential energy into kinetic catastrophe. In indirect fire, You had time to check and double in direct fire at closing armor. You had however long it took for the tank commander to notice you existed. The math was different now, stripped of its peacetime complexity. Range was visual, what you could see was what you could hit. Elevation was nearly flat. The tube dropped until it pointed straight at the approaching armor. Windage didn't matter at this distance. Lead didn't matter because they weren't tracking a moving target across the landscape. They were waiting for the landscape to bring the target to them. All the elaborate fire direction calculations reduced to a single primitive equation point. The biggest gun you have at the thing trying to kill you, and fire before it fires first. The Tiger's 88mm gun could punch through the Howitzer's gun shield like tissue paper. It could do the same to every man in the crew, and to the trees behind them, and to anything else in its path for the next mile. The only advantage the Americans had was surprise. And surprise lasted exactly as long as it took for one German crewman to notice that the artillery piece in the tree line wasn't pointing at the sky. The gun commander gave the order. The lanyard pulled. The breech mechanism, stressed in ways its designers never intended, slammed a firing pin into the primer of a powder charge never meant for flat trajectory fire. The laws of physics, indifferent to doctrine and design specifications, proceeded to demonstrate what happens when you detonate several pounds of propellant behind a 200-pound projectile in a confined space. The recoil was catastrophic. The Howitzer's carriage, designed to absorb the upward and backward thrust of high-angle fire, now had to manage forces it was never calculated to handle. The spades dug deeper into frozen earth. The entire weapon shifted backward, its mounting points screaming with stress. One crew member would later describe it as trying to hold on to an earthquake, but the shell flew true. At 800 yards, there was no appreciable drop, no time for wind drift, no complex ballistics to calculate. The projectile, designed to crack bunkers and collapse buildings, struck the lead Tiger's frontal armor at a velocity and angle its designers had never anticipated facing. The impact generated temperatures that momentarily exceeded the surface of the sun. Steel, proud German steel that had turned aside countless anti-tank rounds, behaved like all matter does when you apply enough energy. It failed. The Tiger didn't explode the way tanks do in movies. It died the way real armored vehicles die when their ammunition cooks off with a gout of flame from every opening, a sound like reality, tearing, and then stillness. The commander who'd been visible in the cupola simply wasn't there anymore. The 70-ton machine that had seemed unstoppable seconds earlier was now a burning monument to the fact that armor is only as good as the threats its designers imagined. The other 7 Tigers stopped. This was sensible. When your lead element suddenly transforms into a crematorium, you reassess. Tank commanders began scanning for the threat, trying to identify what had killed their companion. Artillery was a danger, they understood. You buttoned up, you spread out, you kept moving. But artillery fired over hills at coordinates called by observers. Artillery didn't reach out and touch you directly. Not like this. The American crew was already reloading. The loader was cursing, his hands torn and bleeding from wrestling another shell into place. The powder bag followed, rammed home with a fury born of terror and determination. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the surviving Tigers identified their position, 30 seconds to prepare a weapon system for a role it was never meant to play, and to do it faster than they'd ever done it before. If you've studied the Battle of the Bulge, or if your family has stories from that winter, share them in the comments below. These personal accounts help us understand the human dimension of historical events. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our exploration of untold chapters from the war. The second Tiger came into the improvised crosshairs, being generous for a sight system designed to calculate angles and elevations, not point and shoot. The gun commander was estimating now using instincts developed from months of training and the focused clarity that comes when evolution pours every available neurochemical into your brain, because death is close and getting closer. The second shot carried the same fundamental mathematics as the first, but the variables had changed. The crew had learned from the initial firing. They braced harder, anticipated the Ricar's violence, adjusted their stance. The Howitzer itself had learned to, in the sense that its components had stressed and settled into this new, terrible purpose. Metal remembered strain the way human bodies remember trauma. This projectile found a Tiger that had begun to turn, presenting more angular armor still futile against the kinetic energy being delivered. The shell struck at an oblique angle, and for a microsecond it seemed possible the armor might deflect it. Then physics reasserted itself, and the Tiger's turret ring, the mechanical weakness every tank design carries, failed. The turret didn't fly off dramatically. It simply stopped rotating, locked in place by bent metal and dead crewmen. A weapon system reduced to a steel coffin in the time it takes your heart to beat twice. The remaining 6 Tigers now understood they were under direct fire, though from what weapon they likely still couldn't fathom. Doctrine said to suppress the threat, maneuver forward flanking shots, call for infantry support, but they were in forest terrain where maneuver was limited, visibility was poor, and their supposed prey had somehow grown teeth that could bite through armor plate. 3 of the Tigers made the decision to advance not out of courage, particularly though courage was required, but because backing up a 70-ton vehicle through forest is harder than going forward. And because tank crews are trained to attack threats, not flee from them, their commanders were trying to identify the source of fire, their gunners searching for a target, their drivers accelerating with the characteristic roar of Maybach engines under load. The American crew is in a rhythm now. The kind of rhythm you can only achieve when you've abandoned all thought of survival and committed entirely to the next 30 seconds. Load, ram aim, fire. A cycle that should have taken minutes, compressed into something faster, something desperate, something that would leave every man in the crew with hearing damage and psychological scars, but just might, let him live long enough to worry about that. The 3rd shot took the rightmost Tiger in a location tankers call the lower glacis, angled frontal armor that protects the hull's underside. This is typically one of the stronger points on a tank's profile, engineered to deflect incoming rounds downward into Earth. But the M115's shell wasn't designed to deflect. It was designed to push through obstacles by sheer mass and velocity, and the lower glacis, despite its impressive specifications, was just another obstacle. The penetration was catastrophic, not because it triggered an ammunition explosion that had tanks. Rounds were stored elsewhere, but because the shell continued through the hull, through the driver's compartment, through the engine block, and out the rear deck before detonating in the open air behind the tank. The Tiger rolled forward another 20 feet on momentum and nerve reflexes from a driver who was no longer conscious, then settled into the earth like a building taking its final rest. 5 Tigers remained. 2 of them were reversing now. Commanders having made the calculation that whatever was killing their formation wasn't worth pressing, pride and doctrine said attack, but survival instinct. That older and wiser counselor said that advancing into an unknown killing zone was how entire units got destroyed. They backed up with the awkward grace of heavy armor in reverse, trying to maintain some semblance of formation while retreating through terrain that hadn't been kind in the forward direction. But 3 Tigers continued forward, and they'd finally identified the source of their torment. The Howitzer's position was obvious. Now the massive muzzle blast from each shot was impossible to hide, and the direct fire profile made the gun's location clear to anyone looking in the right direction. 3 80-80 guns began to traverse toward the American position. And when an 80-80 fires, it fires with a precision that artillery howitzers don't possess. This was the weapon's natural environment direct engagement. Tracked target crew that trained endlessly for exactly this moment. The American gun commander watched the Tiger turrets rotate and understood with perfect clarity that the next 30 seconds would determine everything. His crew could fire perhaps 2 more times before the Tigers acquired them fully. After that, the mathematics became very simple and very final. The only question was whether they could destroy 3 Tigers in the time it took those Tigers to destroy them. If your family has connections to artillery units or armored combat, or if you've studied the tactics of the Battle of the Bulge, share your insights in the comments below. These discussions help preserve historical understanding. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of untold history. The 4th shot was rushed, fired before the crew had fully recovered from the previous recoil. The shell flew low, impacting the ground 30 feet in front of the nearest Tiger and detonating on contact. This should have been a miss, a waste of critical seconds and a precious shell. But 200-pound high-explosive rounds don't miss in the traditional sense. The blast crater appeared instantly, and the Tiger, advancing at speed, couldn't avoid it. The right track went into the hole, the sprocket assembly seized, and the entire vehicle slewed violently to the right, presenting its thinner side armor to the American position, while its own gun pointed uselessly at the forest canopy. The crew loaded faster than they'd thought possible, hands moving with mechanical efficiency, breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the physiological response to mortal terror. The Howitzer's breech was hot enough now to burn skin on contact, the metal having absorbed shot after shot of thermal and kinetic abuse. The weapon was being used in ways that should have caused mechanical failure, and the only reason it hadn't was because American manufacturing built artillery pieces with tolerances that anticipated a certain amount of abuse and misuse. The fifth shot caught the immobilized Tiger in its side armor, the precise location where designers had made reasonable compromises between protection and weight. At nearly point-blank range, these compromises proved fatal. The shell penetrated the sponson, entered the crew compartment, and found the ammunition storage. The resulting explosion was violent enough that the turret did separate from the hull. Though not with Hollywood theatrics, it simply lifted slightly and came to rest canted at an angle that made the tank look like a wounded animal trying to rise. 4 Tigers down, 2 retreating, 2 still advancing. The mathematics had changed, but not improved. The surviving Tigers were close now, close enough that their commanders could see the American crew working their Howitzer with desperate speed. At this range, the AT-8s couldn't miss. The question was only which weapon fired next. The American crew knew they had time for one more shot before the Tigers acquired them fully. 1 shot against 2 targets. The decision was instant and instinctive. They chose the Tiger, whose gun was already traversing toward them. The immediate threat, the one whose commander had calculated angles and ranges and was about to transform those calculations into high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds. The 6th shot left the Howitzer with the same physics as the previous 5, but desperation has its own precision. The shell struck the Tiger's gun mantlet, the armored housing that protects the main gun's mounting. This is among the strongest points on a tank's frontal profile. Layers of steel designed to protect the weapon that protects the crew. But the mantlet is also a complex mechanical system, and complex systems fail in interesting ways when you hit them with 200 pounds of high explosive. The Tiger's gun didn't explode. It simply stopped working, bent inward at an angle that made traverse impossible. Elevation frozen. The tank was effectively disarmed, still mobile, still protected by its armor, but no longer a threat to anyone it couldn't physically crush. The commander began reversing immediately. A 70-ton Warrior reduced to fleeing because its primary weapon had been surgically removed by a Howitzer crew who'd abandoned doctrine for survival. 1 Tiger remained, and its gun was tracking. The American crew was loading their 7th round when the Tiger fired. The 88mm shell crossed the intervening distance in less time than human nerves could register. Traveling at velocities where air resistance became a visible phenomenon, it struck the Howitzer's gun shield with a sound that was felt more than heard. A fundamental vibration that suggested matter coming apart at the molecular level. The gun shield held? Barely, because American steel mills had forged it with standards that slightly exceeded theoretical requirements. But held is relative when you're discussing armor penetration. The shell didn't punch completely through, but spalling the fragments of metal thrown off the impeternity, the interior of the gun position into a zone of supersonic shrapnel. 3 crew members went down immediately, torn by fragments that had been part of their own defensive armor microseconds earlier. The remaining crew members didn't pause to check casualty. There wasn't time. The wounded would live or die based on decisions made in the next 10 seconds. And the only decision that mattered was whether the 7th shell would chamber before the Tiger fired again. The loader, blood running down his face from a scalp wound, rammed the projectile home. The gun commander, working the traverse with hands that no longer felt pain because the body had decided pain was a luxury for later, centered the reticle on the Tiger's hull. The Tiger was reloading somewhere inside that armored shell. A German crew was performing the same desperate choreographic extract spent casing, load new round, close breach, acquire target. They were professionals, trained in gunnery schools that had refined tank warfare to a science. They were fast, but they weren't fast enough. If you have stories about artillery operations, or if your family served in armored or anti-armor units, share them in the comments below. These personal histories preserve the human element that makes history real. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of the war. The 7th shot was the best of them, though best is a strange word when discussing deliberate destruction. It was the best because the gun commander had learned from the previous 6, because muscle memory had developed across 7 minutes of controlled catastrophe, because sometimes repetition creates a kind of terrible expertise. The shell struck the Tiger's frontal armor at the weakest point, not because the crew aimed for weakness, but because angles and armor thickness conspired in that moment to create a fatal vulnerability. The penetration was clean, if such a word applies to armor defeat. The shell entered the crew compartment with most of its kinetic energy intact. What happened next would show up in post-battle analysis as catastrophic kill military terminology for when a tank stops being a weapons system and becomes a steel tomb. The Tiger rolled forward another length, then stopped with the abruptness of machinery whose crew is no longer capable of operating it. Silence fell across the Belgian forest, the kind of silence that follows violence, when even the wind seems uncertain about disturbing what's just occurred. 8 Tigers had approached. 4 were burning. 1 was immobilized and disarmed. 3 had retreated into the forest depths, their commanders making the reasonable calculation that survival outweighed objective completion. The American gun crew stood in their position, stunned by the fact that they were standing at all. 3 men were wounded. Non-fatally, the gun shield had absorbed enough of the Tiger's shell to reduce what should have been death to injury. The Howitzer itself looked like it had been through a stress test designed by SED. The recoil mechanism was partially damaged, the carriage was cracked, and the bore was hot enough to see a slight wavering distortion in the air above it. They had fired 7 shots in approximately 4 minutes against the Armade should never have engaged, using a weapon in a role it was never designed for, and they had survived. Military historians would later debate whether this engagement happened at all, since the tactics were so fundamentally unsound that accepting them as real sometimes desperation creates its own doctrine. The gun commander would receive a decoration for his actions that day, though he would later say the only thing he'd done was refuse to die on a reasonable schedule. His crew would receive commendations. The Howitzer itself would be withdrawn from service, its structural integrity compromised beyond field repair. Its barrel worn in ways that suggested it had fired more rounds in 4 minutes than it was designed to fire in its entire service life. But before they could be decorated or withdrawn or analyzed, they had to deal with the immediate aftermath of survival. The wounded needed treatment. The position needed to be secured. Higher headquarters needed to be informed that 8 Tigers had been engaged and defeated by a single Howitzer crew using tactics that every manual said were suicidal. The German offensive in the Ardennes would continue for weeks, each day bringing new desperations, new impossibilities, new moments where men discovered that the line between courage and madness was often just a question of what you did when retreat wasn't an option. This engagement was one of thousands, a footnote in a battle that was itself part of a war that was reshaping the world. Yet for the men who stood in that gun position, surrounded by burning armor and the smell of propellant and blood, it was everything. It was the proof that doctrine is what you follow when you have choices, and desperation is what you create when you don't. It was the demonstration that sometimes the right tactic is the wrong one. If the wrong one is all you have, the M115 Howitzer would serve throughout the war and beyond, lobbing shells over hills at targets its crews never saw, fulfilling the role it was designed for with the efficiency that American manufacturing could produce. Thousands of these weapons were built, and most of them never fired at anything they could see. That was appropriate. That was correct. That was how artillery was meant to work. But on that December morning in Belgium, one crew discovered that rules are written by people who weren't there, and that engineering specifications are guidelines until the moment they become obstacles to survival. They had laughed at the gun commander's suggestion back in Louisiana that maybe, possibly, you could fire a heavy howitzer straight at something if you were desperate or crazy enough. Now, they knew the answer. You could, if you accepted that the weapon would never be the same afterward, and neither would you. If you have your own connections to the Battle of the Bulge, or if your family has stories about artillery operations, share them in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of the untold chapters of history. The technical analysis would come later. When engineers examined the damaged howitzer and tried to understand how it had survived forces it wasn't designed to handle, they would find stress fractures in the carriage, metal fatigue in the recoil mechanism, barrel wear that suggested the weapon had been operating at pressures beyond its rated tolerances. The conclusion would be, predictable the engagement was unrepeatable, the tactics unsound, the survival largely a matter of luck and German steel that wasn't quite as invincible as doctrine suggested. But they would also find something else in their analysis, something that wouldn't make it into official reports because it suggested questions nobody wanted to answer. The howitzer had worked. Not perfectly, not safely, not in any way that could be recommended for future operations. But it had worked. When the choice was between dying by doctrine and surviving by improvisation, the gun had delivered. The crew had delivered, and 8 Tigers that should have rolled through. American lines had instead become evidence that sometimes the impossible was just the improbable waiting for someone desperate enough to try. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered for many thanks to the defensive best. The weather that grounded air support, the desperate winter fighting in conditions that made the Eastern Front look hospitable. Historians would analyze the strategic decisions, the intelligence failures, the supply problems that ultimately doomed the German offensive. Military academies would study the tactics, the troop movements, the decisions made at division and corps level. But for the men in that gun position, the battle would always be measured in 7 shots fired in 4 minutes against armor that terrified everyone who faced it. They would remember the sound of the Tiger engines, the crack of the 88 when it hit their gun shield, the smell of propellant and burning metal. They would remember being laughed at for suggesting you could direct fire a heavy howitzer at tanks. And they would remember the moment when the laughter stopped mattering because the Tigers were there and the only question was whether they would try or die. The German tank commanders who survived and retreated would file reports about encountering unexpected anti-capabilities in the American artillery positions. Intelligence officers would try to determine what new weapon had been deployed, what secret anti-tank gun had been brought forward. The possibility that they'd been engaged by standard field artillery pieces used in a non-standard role wouldn't occur to them because it was too absurd to consider seriously. This was perhaps the strangest legacy of the engagement. Both sides would treat it as an anomaly, a fluke, a moment that proved nothing except that war occasionally produces outcomes that defy reasonable prediction. The Americans wouldn't update their tactics manuals to include direct fire engagement of heavy armor by field artillery because that would be insane. The Germans wouldn't revise their doctrine to account for the possibility of being engaged by howitzers at point-blank range because that would suggest their tactical assumptions had fundamental flaws. Everyone would agree that what happened that morning was unrepeatable and therefore not worth analyzing as anything other than a curiosity. They were probably right. Probabilities suggest that attempting to direct fire heavy howitzers at tanks should result in dead artillery crews and intact armor. Statistics support doctrine. The math works out clearly when you calculate armor thickness, gun traverse rates, crew training, and engagement ranges. But statistics are what happens across thousands of engagements, and doctrine is written for the common case. This was a single engagement. One moment on one morning when the statistics hadn't been consulted and the doctrine had been abandoned, because neither one was useful when the Tigers appeared through the snow. If you've studied unusual tactics from the Second World War, or if your family has stories about improvisation under fire, share them in the comments below. These accounts help us understand that history isn't just what was planned, but what happened when plans failed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of untold chapters from the war. The wounded crew members would recover, though 2 would never serve in combat again, not because of physical disability, but because something breaks in the human psyche. When you survive an engagement you absolutely shouldn't have survived. They would finish the war in training positions, teaching new artillery crews how to calculate firing solutions and operate heavy weapons by the book. Neither would mention the morning they ignored the book entirely, not because it was classified, but because they couldn't find words that made the story sound like something that actually happened rather than something imagined. The gun commander would stay with his crew through the remainder of the Bulge, then continue through Germany until the war ended. He would never again order direct fire against armored targets, partly because the opportunity never arose, and partly because he understood that luck doesn't repeat. He had pulled the lanyard 7 times in 4 minutes and lived to file a report about it. That was a gift, and gifts aren't given twice. After the war, he would return to civilian life like millions of others, the uniform exchanged for ordinary clothes. The combat decorations put in a drawer, the memories filed away in whatever mental compartment soldiers use for experiences they can't explain to people who weren't there. He would tell his children that he served in the artillery, that he saw combat in the Ardennes, that he was fortunate to come home whole. He wouldn't tell them about the Tigers, about the impossible firing solution, about the moment when doctrinal suicide became tactical necessity. The howitzer itself would be cannibalized for parts, its damaged components removed and replaced, its identity absorbed into the vast inventory of American military hardware. There was no plaque, no preservation, no ceremony. It was just equipment, and damaged equipment gets fixed or scrapped depending on maintenance schedules and supply priorities. The men who served that gun would have found this appropriated weapon wasn't important. The mission was, the howitzer had done its job that morning, and that was enough. Years later, a military historian researching the Battle of the Bulge would come across the after-action report from that December morning. He would read it twice, check the unit identification, verify the date, and then set it aside as unreliable. Artillery crews don't engage Tiger tanks at direct fire range and survive. The report had to be exaggerated, misremembered, or deliberately falsified for some purpose that wasn't immediately clear. He would file it under unverified accounts and move on to documents with better supporting evidence. This was reasonable. Historical analysis requires skepticism, especially for claims that seem to violate established tactical understanding. The fact that something appeared in an official report didn't make it true, just documented. Real history required corroboration, multiple sources, consistency with known doctrine and capabilities. The historian was wrong, but he was wrong for defensible reasons. The engagement was real, the tactics were exactly as insane as they appeared, and the survival was as improbable as the analysis suggested. But improbable isn't impossible. And history is full of moments that shouldn't have happened, but did because someone was desperate or clever or lucky enough to make the impossible work once. The real lesson, if there was one, wasn't about tactics or training or equipment capabilities. It was about the moment when you realize that all the preparation, all the doctrine, all the careful planning has become irrelevant because reality has presented a problem that exists outside the boundaries of what you prepared for. In that moment, you can follow the rules and die correctly, or you can break them and maybe, possibly, find out that the rules were more flexible than anyone wanted to admit. If your family has military history, or if you've studied the innovations born from desperation in combat, share those stories in the comments below. These accounts remind us that history is written by people who often had to figure things out as they went. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the untold chapters of history. The Battle of the Bulge would end in January 1945. The German offensive ground down by Allied resistance, terrible weather, and supply lines that couldn't sustain the ambitious operation. The cost was staggering. American casualties numbered over 80,000. German losses exceeded 100,000. And civilian populations caught in the combat zones paid prices that don't appear in military casualty figures. In the larger narrative of the war, the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive in the West, the final attempt to reverse Allied momentum with a bold strike that might force negotiations. It failed, as it probably had to fail given the material and manpower disparities by late 1944. The outcome was never really in doubt once the initial shock wore off and Allied forces adjusted to the new threat. But for the people in that particular time and place, the outcome was very much in doubt. For the infantry dug in behind that artillery position, for the crews of other vehicles that the Tigers would have engaged if they'd broken through, for the field hospitals and supply depots and command posts that existed in the Tigers' path, the question of whether 8 tanks would be stopped or would continue their advance was existential. And they were stopped not by tank destroyers or air support or any of the systems specifically designed to defeat armor, but by an artillery crew that refused to accept that their weapon wasn't applicable to the problem at hand. They looked at a tool designed for one purpose and used it for another because the alternative was abandoning their position and letting the Tigers through. This kind of improvisation happened thousands of times during the war, in every theater, in every service, among troops from every nation. Combat engineers used their equipment in ways the manufacturers never imagined. Infantry adapted tactics on the fly. Tankers discovered field modifications that improved their vehicles' combat performance. Pilots pushed their aircraft beyond rated limitations when the mission required it. Most of these improvisations were never recorded, never analyzed, never incorporated into doctrine. They were one-time solutions to immediate problems, forgotten as soon as the crisis passed. The Howitzer crew's engagement with the Tigers would have joined this forgotten majority except for one. Think someone filed a report, and that report survived long enough for historians to find it and argue about whether it actually happened. The truth is that it did happen, exactly as described, with all the tactical insanity and improbable survival that makes historians skeptical. The evidence exists in after-action reports, casualty figures, and the testimony of men who were there. The fact that it seems impossible is irrelevant. War produces impossible outcomes regularly, which is why veterans have trouble explaining their experiences to people who weren't present. You can't convey the reality of firing a heavy howitzer at point-blank range against the most feared tank in the German arsenal to someone whose reference frame is peacetime normalcy. You can't explain the decision-making process that leads to attempting something that violates every tactical principle you were taught. The words exist, but the context doesn't translate. So the story remains, documented but doubted, recorded but questioned, a footnote in a larger battle that was itself part of an even larger war. The men who were there know what happened. The howitzer that fired those 7 shots is long since scrapped. The tigers that burned that morning are rust in memory. Only the story survives. And stories are fragile things, especially when they describe events that shouldn't have been possible. If you have connections to the units that fought in the Ardennes, or if your family has stories about improvisation under fire, share them in the comments below. These personal accounts are how we preserve the human dimension of historical events. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of the untold chapters from the war. The snow continued falling that December morning after the engagement ended, covering the burned-out tanks, filling the shell craters, softening the hard edges of combat into something that looked almost peaceful from a distance. The artillery crew worked to treat their wounded, secure their position, and prepare for whatever came next. There was no celebration, no moment of triumph. They had survived, which was victory enough. Other positions along the line were being hit by the German offensive, other crews facing their own impossible situations. Some would survive through luck or skill or desperation. Others wouldn't. The Bulge would grind on for weeks, each day bringing new casualties, new moments where trained soldiers had to make decisions that their training hadn't covered. This is the nature of Combatit presents problems faster than doctrine can address them, and the solutions that work often look nothing like what the manuals prescribed. The officers who write field manuals do so from positions of reflection and analysis, drawing lessons from previous conflicts and current technology. They create doctrine that works most of the time for most units in most situations. But there's always a gap between doctrine and reality, and that gap is where soldiers live when the fighting starts. The doctrine says artillery pieces operate in the indirect fire role, protected from enemy observation, engaging targets at range. The reality is sometimes you're dug in where you're dug in, and the enemy comes from an unexpected direction. And your choices are limited to Batintar, Novamente, Zero, continued options, and worse ones. The gun commander understood this implicitly, which is why he'd suggested the direct fire technique during training, despite the ridicule it provoked. He'd been thinking about the gap between what the weapon was supposed to do and what it might have to do if circumstances went wrong. His instructors had dismissed the idea because circumstances shouldn't go that wrong, and if they did, you were supposed to displace, not stand and fight. But displacement takes time, and time is something you don't have when tigers appear through the tree line at 800 yards. The gap between doctrine and reality had opened in front of him that morning, and he'd made the only choice that offered a chance of closing it. The fact that it worked didn't make it smart, it made it lucky, but luck counts, especially when the alternative is certain deaths. The German forces would continue pressing their offensives for another month, achieving initial successes that had terrified Allied command before supply shortages and determined resistance ground the advance to a halt. The tigers that retreated from this engagement would fight again elsewhere, their crews carrying forward the memory of the morning they'd lost half their formation to, something that shouldn't have been able to hurt them. Those German tankers would be more cautious afterward, more aware that even weapon systems designed for indirect fire could become direct threats, given the right circumstances and the wrong luck. This caution would save some of their lives in subsequent engagements and cost them tactical opportunities in others. Fear has that effect: it protects you from risks that might kill you, but it also prevents you from taking risks that might win the battle. The American artillery crews, meanwhile, would not generally adopt direct fire tactics against armor. The engagement remained an anomaly, discussed quietly among veterans but never incorporated into official training. This was probably wise. Attempting to repeat the tactic would have gotten a lot of crews killed without achieving similar results, because the specific conditions that made it work that morning: a surprise, terrain, range. The psychological impact on the German tank commanders were not as war is full of these singular moments, tactics that worked once and should never be tried again. Bayonet charges against machine gun positions occasionally succeeded, but that didn't make them sound doctrine. Individual soldiers performed acts of incredible courage that achieved tactical objectives, but you couldn't train an army to rely on such courage appearing when needed. The Howitzer engagement fell into this category: real, documented, and entirely unsuitable for inclusion in tactical manuals. If you've researched the evolution of combined arms tactics, or if your family has stories about unconventional approaches to combat problems, share them in the comments below. These discussions help us understand how doctrine evolves and where innovation comes from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of untold military history. The M115 Howitzer would continue in American service long after the Second World War ended, seeing use in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Its design proved robust and reliable, capable of delivering heavy fire support across decades of technological change. Thousands of shells would arc through the sky from these weapons, each one following the trajectory and mission profile that the designers intended. None of those shells would be fired the way those 7 were fired that December morning. The direct fire engagement remained a footnote, a story told among veterans, a moment that seemed increasingly impossible as time passed and memories softened to the hard edges. Young soldiers hearing the story would be skeptical. Surely the reports were exaggerated. Surely the Germans had retreated for other reasons. Surely a heavy howitzer couldn't actually engage armor at point-blank range and survive. The veterans who'd been there would shrug and offer no argument. They knew what they'd seen, what they'd done, what had happened. Whether anyone believed them was irrelevant. The belief or disbelief of people who weren't present didn't change the reality of having been there, of having pulled that lanyard, of having watched tigers burn from impacts they should never have received from a weapon they should never have faced. This is the gap that always exists between veterans and civilians, between those who experienced combat and those who study it. The students of war work with documents and analysis, trying to understand patterns and extract lessons. The practitioners of war work with whatever tools they have available when the enemy arrives, trying to survive long enough to file the reports that historians will later doubt. Both perspectives are valid. The historians are right to be skeptical most. Combat reports contain errors, exaggerations, and misremembered details. Memory is unreliable, especially under stress. The fog of war is real, and participants often don't understand what happened, even when they were present for it. Rigorous analysis requires questioning sources and demanding corroboration. But the veterans are also right. They were there. They know what happened. Even if they can't explain it in ways that satisfy academic rigor, the impossibility of an event doesn't negate its occurrence when you're the person who experienced it. Sometimes things that shouldn't work do work, and the fact that they're not repeatable doesn't make them less real. The howitzer crew would carry this knowledge forward through the rest of their lives, the certain understanding that on one December morning, they had done something impossible and survived it. They wouldn't need validation from historians or recognition from the military establishment. They had their own validation, written in fire and steel, and the continued existence of their own breathing. The broader war would continue its terrible mathematics, millions of individual moments of courage or luck or desperation, aggregating into campaigns and battles and strategic outcomes. The personal would be subsumed into the historical, individual stories compressed into statistics, names becoming numbers in casualty reports and order of battle tables. But the numbers were made of people, and the statistics represented individual moments of choice under pressure. Every casualty figure contains someone's son or husband or father. Every tactical success was built on hundreds of small decisions made by soldiers trying to accomplish missions while staying alive. The grand strategic narrative was real, but so were the thousands of micro-narratives that composed it. The engagement between one American howitzer crew and 8 German Tigers was one such micro-narrative. It didn't change the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. It didn't alter strategic calculations or shift divisional boundaries. In the vast scope of the war, it was meaningless. Few tanks destroyed, a few dozen casualties, a position held that might have been held anyway by different means. But to the men behind that artillery position, the ones who would have faced those Tigers if the howitzer crew had retreated, it meant everything. To the gun crew themselves, it meant the difference between life and death, between abandoning their post and holding it, between accepting that their weapon was useless against armor and discovering that useful is sometimes just a question of how desperate you're willing to be. If your family served in the Second World War, or if you've studied the small unit actions that composed the larger battles, share those stories in the comments below. These personal accounts help us remember that history happens to individuals, not just nations. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the untold chapters of military history. The December snow fell heavier as the day progressed, covering the evidence of the morning's violence. By evening, the burned Tigers looked like dark shapes beneath white blankets. The destruction softened by natural processes that don't care about human conflict. The gun position remained occupied. The crew, still alert despite exhaustion, because the German offensive hadn't stopped just because one small engagement had gone badly for them. Other formations would probe the line, other commanders would attempt to find weaknesses, other soldiers would face their own moments of crisis and decision. The Bulge is a vast operation involving hundreds of thousands of men across a front that stretched 4 miles. One engagement, however dramatic for its participants, was just a pixel in a much larger picture. This is both humbling and important to remember. The Howitzer crew's story matters because it mattered to them, and because it demonstrates something true about combat and human nature under pressure. But it doesn't matter in the sense of altering grand historical outcomes. The war would have ended the same way whether those 7 shots were fired or not. Germany would still have lost, the Allies would still have won, the political and strategic realities would have remained unchanged, yet this doesn't diminish the significance of the moment for the people who lived it. History operates at multiple scales simultaneously: the grand strategic, the operational, the tactical, and the personal. Events can be insignificant at one scale while being existentially important at another. The Howitzer engagement was strategically meaningless but personally crucial. A footnote in military history, but a defining moment in individual lives. This is true for most combat actions. The vast majority of firefights, small unit engagements, and individual acts of courage or sacrifice don't appear in history books because they didn't change strategic outcomes. But they changed the people who experienced them, and they determined who lived to see the war end and who didn't. That has to count for something, even if it doesn't rate a chapter in the official histories. The gun commander would think about this sometimes in the years after the war, when he was far from combat and the memories had settled into the shapes they would keep. He'd wonder whether telling the story mattered, whether anyone would believe it, whether there was value in preserving accounts of moments that defied reasonable probability. He never found satisfactory answers to these questions, but he told the story anyway, to anyone who would listen, because it seemed important that someone remember what had happened that morning. Some people believed him. Others smiled politely and changed the subject. A few called him a liar or suggested his memory was faulty. He didn't argue with any of them. The truth of the engagement existed independent of whether anyone acknowledged it. The Tigers had burned. The crew had survived. Those facts didn't require consensus to remain facts. This is perhaps the final lesson from that December morning, that truth is not democratic and reality doesn't care about plausibility.